All right. Our psalm this morning, well, our scripture this morning is a psalm, Psalm 100, and I was in my email to Steve and Joanne, I said I'm going to use the whole thing. It isn't the shortest thing you'd find, but it is only 5 verses. The letters are really little small on my page here, so it's not very long at all. But I pretend it is. There's a good bit of information here for us. So. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before Him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is good, and that He made us, and we are His, and we are His people, the sheep of His pasture. Enter His gates with thanksgiving, and His courts with praise. Give thanks to Him, and praise His name. For the Lord is good, and His love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. All right, so Thanksgiving is imminent. You know what it means to me? It means that the year is almost over. Okay? It's my alarm clock that says, oh my goodness, the year's done. Because I know from here on, we're on that race to Christmas, and then it'll suddenly... Well, it won't be long until 18 is gone, and anyway. So I was sort of reminded of it when I was in Gainesville. I went over to the Walmart, because you have to go to a Walmart somewhere, and I thought, well, the turkeys were stacked up like somebody's winter wood supply. There were so many turkeys and hams, and then I tried to go back to the front of the store, and all the stuff that I guess people would call traditional, at least on the TV commercials, it's like one buggy wide going down those broad aisles, because you got the bread stuffing on one side, and you got I guess pumpkin pie stuffing on the other side. Traffic in the mall in the Walmart was terrible. Now, sort of is anyway, but I'm just saying it's so it told me that we're almost at the end of the year, and it is a time that we traditionally try to celebrate, especially with family and other things. We sort of hinted at some of those. I guess the speed of the year ending sort of surprised me, but when the alarm clock went off, I realized it. But actually, I realized it about maybe 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, I saw my first focused Christmas jewelry commercial, and I remember rolling my eyes. Oh no, it's already started. I think it may have even been before Halloween. I'm not sure how far back it was, but that was my response. I was not joyful that people were starting to talk about Christmas yet. So, I don't know, maybe my year hadn't gone that well in some ways. I guess I shouldn't be surprised at the speed or the rapid progression of commercial Christmas advertising. I don't guess any of us should be, because it's the same every year. All those things just sort of roll over us. Today's scripture, I'll tell you, is not about Christmas. Now, if that surprises you, you didn't hear Christmas listed in there anywhere, and you didn't have anybody talking about baby Jesus in what we read this morning. It might surprise you a little, though, to figure out the scripture is a little bit about Thanksgiving, but it's not about our modern Thanksgiving. Our modern Thanksgiving, back in our country's start, is really very new holiday compared to how this psalm is focusing people and leading people to come to a state of worship. So while it uses the word Thanksgiving in the 5th verse, it's not the way we consider it. In fact, the word Thanksgiving, when it's translated from the Hebrew, which is where this particular passage is, the oldest things we have, it actually is translated back out in the most simple form as being confession. Now, I know we have ideas of what we think confession is, and I don't think we always like the idea of having to talk about confession. Someone having to admit something that they've done wrong. The burglar that confesses that he did the crime, or maybe as a kid we had to confess, I was the one that broke the lamp. And there are all kinds of things that we've in our lives have had to confess, and I know that I'm sure all of you pretty much would think that every preacher you've ever known has probably talked about the need to confess to stay in a right relationship with God. So confession is something that we have, a pretty similar idea about. It's the kind of thing that we tend to say, well, okay, we've got to confess our sin, and some of those confessions are things that we have to repeat again and again. We could come up with all kinds of examples. In fact, I cut all those out just because I had too many personal ones. I didn't want to go there. The idea is confession is something that if we do it often enough, we feel like it gets to be sort of automatic. Renee, I love you, and she says, yeah, I love you too. And it's not quite the same as when we were dating. And oh, I love you. It can become something simpler where yes, we mean it, but it's not quite as passionate. So this psalm is about worship. This song is about pointing in how we should be responding to some things we know about God. So we don't want it to become meaningless to have confession. In this case, the word confession isn't our confession. In a way it is, but it's not exactly our confession for what we've done wrong. It's our confession about what we know and celebrate about God. So it's not about, Lord, I failed to worship you properly. I sang bad notes in the hymn today. I have all these mistakes. I was rude to that person on the phone. No, that's not the confessions we were talking about. Things that we read in the psalm, and even some of the things you heard in the music today, and God being faithful. And those are the things that we are supposed to confess. But even those, sometimes we have trouble confessing things because we're not sure we're saying the right things, the right words. I know as we think back over time, I know that I have learned a lot about God informally from family and from church experience and all kinds of ways that people have touched me, that God gave me information about Himself. Because what we're really trying to do is come up with, when we confess things, it's about, the two simple words would be God's character and God's actions. And then we also use words like grace and love and the changes in our lives and things like that. So all those things are ways that we end up knowing something about the character and the actions of God. And we might use words where we focus on specific things, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of your confession. The big picture is what the psalmist is talking about, this celebration of coming into God's presence and things like that. So, how do we confess what we know about the Lord? And sometimes people go, well, I don't know. We could be having the bad times like we know some people are having, even now, and a festive holiday season starting, and things aren't so good. And so it's hard sometimes for us to come up with technically testifying about the good things in your life. That's normal. That's the way it goes, and to me, that's part of what church is about. Is we do share some of those burdens and help people to be raised up, and we can't help them all the way, but it is part of our confession. Sometimes we can look back at our life and we can confess how good God was during our hard times, but rarely when we're in the middle of our hard times. So this confessing the things that God has done ties in both the greatest times and the worst of times, sort of going with the title of the book years ago that I was reading in high school. But there always ought to be at least something, no matter how bad we are having it, that we can connect to about God's actions. We talk about salvation. We talk about other experiences where we can connect to God. We can talk about just special moments in our lives. This psalm is all about worship and speaking out. Started out with shout to the Lord. That's, you're going to say something, some kind of noise, singing and celebrating God. And so I was thinking about it, and so I thought, well, there's nothing really too scary in this description of worship as we go down the list. The word confession, since we know it's not about us having to confess the wrong things we've done, but the right things God has done, then that falls pretty easy. But that first line of shout to the Lord, all the earth, and I thought, well, okay, that one's the only one that's sort of suspect. I think that in our worship experience, typically shouting is not common. So we use our inside shout voices. Does that work? Sometimes we seem to be reserved. Worship the Lord with a gladness. That seems pretty easy to do. We can be pointed in the right direction, and we can enjoy the music and the songs and hopefully moments in the sermon. Anytime we think about God, we should be able to come to a moment of worship of God ourselves. Then the third part that just caught my attention is that first three lines, come before him with joyful songs. You can sing a joyful song in the shower. You can sing a joyful song here. You can sing with the radio and offer a joyful song. You can worship God on the way to do something fun, normal, just shopping. Anything that leads you to thinking and lifting up your heart in a way of praising God for things along the path. The thing about the first three lines is, to me, it connects me to looking at not our worship experience here. No, it's automatically included here, but our worship experience. It doesn't say that this is a daily thing, that you go, you enter into God's presence and worship. It doesn't say that it's a daily thing, but I was thinking, the people that would come to visit the temple, sometimes they only got to go to see the temple maybe once in their lifetime. So they didn't have the same kind of weekly worship that we experience. They would go to groups and have Torah study. They would go and have sessions where people did talk about God and Jesus, but it wasn't necessarily filled with music. It was a little more formal. And when you were out in that remote setting, you didn't have, like in any of the villages around Jerusalem, you had a group of people that you could go be with weekly and on the Sabbath. But what made you different was this description of how you should act when you're worshiping God. You can turn it into a positive thing, and some of these psalms they may have sung them at the different synagogues. The thing about the Israelites is that it wasn't that everybody got to go to the temple and witness the professional musicians and the singers and to see the grandeur and the beauty of it. That only happened every so often because it wasn't affordable by most of the people. Now the ones who lived there could go any time, but for most it was, well, they go and they maybe that one time, and then the rest of the time they had to find a way to understand that God was close. And I think that's what happened a lot of times when you're reading the Scripture. They quit worshiping God in their local settings and they start worshiping other gods that had different kind of worship services or opportunities, and so they drift. So this passage is about finding a way to worship God, I believe, in a more regular state, or maybe a daily state. So find a way to offer joyful songs. I sing with the radio. I know I look a little nuts to people, and if I notice them noticing me, then my mouth stops usually. It just happens. I don't know. Offering joyful things to God. He's our creator. He creates life, earth, everything we know. And then this passage says one of the great things we know about God is we are His people. We are believers. We are His people. And you know what? That's overwhelming to me sometimes. God knows my name. God cares about me. And I think, no way. And then the answer comes back, Yahweh. Yahweh cares. That was a meme, by the way, I saw a few months ago. And I just thought it was hilarious, but not everybody gets it. God does know us and care for us. But to get to that next little piece of that first part of the passage, and it describes us as being the sheep of His field. Does that bother y'all? Sometimes I'm more comforted now than I used to be, but I think about, well, am I livestock to God? Is He just going to burn me up? I don't think that's the intention at all. It can be somewhat bothersome. But what it's saying is, the psalmist is saying he understands, or I guess we could say she, but it's probably he understands, is that God cares for His creation. He cares for His sheep. He cares for these creatures. Okay, so God has this role of shepherd, a caregiver, that we know that later He will, in time, it will be Jesus gives Himself as the shepherd on behalf of the sheep, as the analogy will go. But here we have this picture of God as the shepherd, and we are the sheep, which means we are physically limited. Okay, sheep don't have claws. They don't have sharp teeth. Now, I'm sure they can bite you and it hurt, but they can't defend themselves very well. Sheep have a lot of intellectual deficiencies, I understand it. If they recognize you, they'll follow you. They'll get lost. And we have these stories where the shepherd goes and rescues their sheep. So they are limited in their understanding. They don't have the full picture of what's going on. And I believe that sheep have incredibly short memories. We may fit that description better than we think. We're a little bit defenseless. We don't have the full intellectual capacity. I'm not saying we're stupid at all. I'm saying that we don't have the big picture, that we don't understand God as well as we'd like to. And then what we do understand sometimes when the culture or other things challenge us, we can forget. The psalmist encourages an offering of praise to God because we recognize our position. We recognize that this relationship with God He's the one in charge. Makes us sound pitiful in a way. Well, we're just sheep. We're just walking along and we get to graze a little, but I guess compared to God and His view and His intelligence and the things that we think we understand about God, we may seem really low on the scale, but I don't think God thinks of us that way. We know from other places in Scripture, He sees us as precious and valuable in ways that we can't even really imagine why. I know we have people in our lives that we probably aren't worth a lot of our time and different things. Maybe they've done horrible things to us. Maybe they're just people that don't seem to matter to us, and we can easily discount them. And God doesn't discount them. And for the same reason, God doesn't discount us. The only way we have something to be thankful for or testify about or confess about God is we realize the things that God is doing in our lives. I don't know how you'll apply things in your life and to the blessings that you have. I read a little thing that I thought was really interesting. I was randomly searching for illustration things that were interesting, and I ran across this one that says there was this man who was a medical missionary, and he was sent to India, and they were running a clinic, and it was he was taking his several years there, and so he was there, and what he found in the area that he was in is that the people that lived in that region, that a lot of them were going blind by what we would call middle age. They actually considered them old because they became useless. And it was really, really high number. And so he started studying and eventually figured out a treatment that he could do that would stop the progression of blindness. It started out as children with healthy eyes. About the time they were in their 20s, they were losing their vision already, and it wasn't many more years, so they might be completely blind. And so his treatment would stop it. It didn't reverse it. It didn't give them a total healing, but it stopped it. And so as that proved to be successful, these people were being treated and they would go home. And the groups that came would be larger and larger. And so his clinic became more of an eye clinic than a general care because they had found something for that region that was amazing and miraculous and could stop this problem. And the reason people knew about it was because people were telling other people. They weren't advertising, we've got a cure for this thing. He said in his note, that these people didn't say thank you to him for him stopping this loss of sight. They had a different word. See, their phrase didn't include the ability to say just thank you. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't grateful. It doesn't mean they weren't excited about the fact that they were heading back home. The phrase that they used, this one word that they started with, I will tell your name. The ones who received this healing through this ministry that he was doing, this stop of, suddenly they aren't going to total darkness in their life. Once they were receiving the treatment, they would leave and then they would tell people, hey, I've had somebody take away my blindness. I can see, or I can still see, and this is the man that did it. Now, he wasn't going for a personal thing. He was a missionary. He was telling them about Jesus and God, and part of his work, though, was just purely in the ministry of being a healer. Can you think of the power that is if you realize something fantastic has saved something as important as your vision, and all they're not asking for money, so the only thing they do is when they go home, they say, hey, yeah, they healed my eyes, I can see better, I'm better, I'm not losing my sight anymore, maybe I'm taking my vitamin D pills. I don't know what the therapy was, but he said that this growth exploded because people were saying, we know this clinic, we know this man, and if we were doing that for the things that are radical and amazing in our lives that God has been doing for us, would we or shouldn't we be more excited than maybe we are and sharing? I mean, God's done some radical stuff, and usually we have a lot of appreciation for it at the beginning of our Christian walk. I don't think God has ever left me alone out there. Are we praising these wonderful things as we go forward in our lives? I don't know. I didn't. As I thought about it this morning, I was thinking, God works by word of mouth advertising. Word of mouth. A small business, they don't have enough money to pay for a lot of advertising, so their customers tell somebody else. Isn't that the way God works? Is people tell other people? Other people in our lives can hear about God in a lot of different ways. But where does the most valuable word of mouth advertising come to the people we know, our families, our friends, other people that might be along our path that we sort of hit it off with? Wouldn't you think that would come from a person who seems to be excited and would mention occasionally that God was in their life and that God had done so much for them, they may not be able to tell the whole story, or I had this problem? Sometimes we don't want to talk about what our problems were in the past, so maybe we don't bring it up, but sometimes people are having something similar in their life. Isn't that a perfect opportunity to give God a little word of mouth, a little praise, maybe a little confession about your life and the things that have happened for you? I got one story. Years ago, I was walking along this sidewalk, and it was a dimly lit area, and I'm just going from one place to another. It wasn't like I was going far, but coming down the street from the other side, the sidewalk from the other side, there was a man. I could see him, and he's moving along. We weren't going to bump into each other, just enough light. And as he got closer, I could see he was wearing one of those motorcyclist vests that have the patches on them, and he was a pretty big guy. And the closer he got, the bigger he got. And then I could see he had a big beard that was just looked wild and straggly and long, like some of the ZZ Top or something. I don't know. That he just looked scary. And as he got right beside me, and like right here, he stops and he turns and he says, "Hey, will you go to a meeting with me?" Sure. Where are we going? Just right over there. And so we go to this little fire pit area. And I was really relieved that there were about 20 people there hanging out already, and they weren't all wearing motorcycle vests, so I thought, okay, I'm not the turkey in this case. I'm not the one going to... So what I found out within just a few minutes is this gentleman named Dave Cooey, who I know some people in here know, he looked like a biker. He was a biker. He still drove his Harley, rain or shine. He had been a real Hell's Angel. Not a pretend club. He was a drug runner. He was an enforcer. He spent many different sets of time in prison. And one of the last times he was in prison, someone shared their life story with him and was able to give him enough information to realize that even he thought he might be saved by God. While he was a giant of a man, he could intimidate you. That was not the way he loved you. He might hurt you hugging you by accident. I worked with him several times on different other things in the future. I met him, I was at Rock Eagle when I was walking down that path, so I really wasn't that threatened. But when you walk along the path and you see somebody that big, there was some little worry. I really wasn't so scared that I ran. Your story is more powerful than you realize. His story for me, I was, rebuilding my faith of coming back here to Chapel Hill and the men's group. Some of us had gone down to Rock Eagle, and that's where Dave was. And he was not he wasn't giving a session. He was just someone to tell people his story. And for me, he was a renewal, or sort of part of that foundation that said, it wasn't the excuse that, well, I'm not that bad. Obviously, God could love me. But it was like, yes, God is so graceful that even someone that has a really bad man history can be changed. Totally, radically changed. And then his life changed person after person as he shared his story. You have a story. I have a story, probably not nearly as radical as Dave's or a few other people I've met in the past. Maybe the changes in you were small, maybe they were radical. But if you are thankful to God, don't let it hold back your testimony. Sharing with someone that might be at the right moment. Sharing with family every time you meet, those that might need to hear it. I'm not saying intimidate. I'm not saying beat them up. I'm not saying trap them in the corner. I'm saying give them the invitation to know that when you were younger, your life might not have been perfect either. You weren't the perfect person that you are today. Be thankful and excited to share your amazing story, because it is just important as anybody else's that you might be willing to share it with or that you have received. When you enter into God's presence, how and what are you going to have in your praise? Do you have praise for those little changes in a family member's life, the opportunities they got? Will you have praise in complete strangers? I know Dave had a lot of complete strangers. Most of us have a little more trouble with complete strangers, but you know what? Our family's important too. Thanksgiving is here. Maybe it's time for you to tell a little piece of your story and how things changed for you, and that you still celebrate God's involvement in your life and your presence in His. All glory be to God.